Thank you all for being here. I'm really, really touched. And the good news is the storm isn't supposed to come until midnight. So you're safe. I have offered many thanks to Ava for this wonderful opportunity, this beautiful space, and especially to Sam Eckert, who, for all things she did, attended to all kinds of details throughout the whole process. And she, yes. Or anything. And she and Chris did a wonderful job planning the show. When I was a little alarmed when I first brought in the pieces. You okay there? I first brought in the pieces. She said, "I want to hang all of these," and I got a little nervous because I thought that the show was going to be overhung if they put everything up. But I left them to it and came back the next day and found that they had done a fantastic job. The very proximity of the pieces, not only did it sort of replicate how they were in my studio before having frames on them, but also the proximity of the pieces allowed you to see the differences between them better than if they'd been separated. And that was a real revelation. And also that the kind of tight ensemble that they made turned it into a whole little world in here. And I think if they'd been further apart, it would have looked more like a room with some paintings. But now it looks like a different little world with some, where the things are kind of ephemeral and kind of hovering there in this little weightless world. So thank you so much. It really, in spite of my worries, it came out better than any show I've ever hung. So thank you. The frames helped a lot. He's not here, but I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Richard Wilson, the frame shop in West Lebanon. He didn't show me the drawer when I went in and said, "Dick, I really want frames that will look like they disappear." and he said, "Okay," and so we worked with that. And he's an artist in his own right, so he's the person I can talk to for a half an hour about different warmths and coolness of a white backing sheet and not get bored. And he's also the most patient framer in the world. And it's always fun to collaborate with him. And I think he did a great job and really contributed to the show. And if anybody sees him, tell him I mentioned it, okay? he's not real social, so I'm not surprised he's not here. But I also wanted to say that before I start talking, I wanted to mention out loud that I appreciate Sam's curating of these simultaneous shows that she's put together in these 3 galleries. I think because of the limited palette in each of the shows, it allows a kind of a resonance in the work that wouldn't be there if there were huge splashes of color in one gallery and then not much color in the other gallery. But the 3 galleries having this very muted palette was a genius curatorial decision. And then you can, if you really get hungry for color, you can go out in the hall and then just all over this. And it's really great. And there's also, if you go out in the hall, there's an artist called Moan Katsik, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, who actually uses little bits of milkweed in her 3D sculptural pieces, which we didn't know until they actually showed up here. And it's particularly nice for me in this gallery right here to have drawings and sculptures by Justin O'Rourke. Justin was a studio art major and intern back in the day when I was teaching it. I think I had him in a drawing class, but I'm not really sure. And he was a student there, a very talented student. But it's wonderful to be showing right next to him in this professional venue and to see him as a fully realized artist and to appreciate the quality of not only of his craft, but of his choice of subject matter, the wit. The idea of making steel ravioli, if you haven't seen it, you have to take a look. Little steel pillows. I mean, it's just, it's lovely and it's beautifully crafted. It's not corny or it's not a joke. It's lovely, and he's really making you understand the substance of things, of contradictory things. And also a nice thing about that is that he's got charcoal drawings that are very different from mine. But it's nice to have rooms with charcoal drawings that are so different from each other. I think it's complementary. And it shows another strength of these shows that are put together. Okay, I have to read notes. I can't wing it. I wish I could, but I can't. This body of work was a big change for me, not only in its origins, but also in its materials and in its evolution. And in my previous work, I found my subject in the world around me. I placed myself there on site and tried to figure out how to make its appearance visible to others, how it appeared to me to be visible for others. I like what Émile Zola, the French writer, commented in reference to work by his friends Manet and Pissarro. He said, "A work of art is a corner of creation seen through a temperament." I just love that quote, because nobody's are the same, and everything is filtered through your temperament. And thank God we can understand other temperaments through art and enhance our own. In my case, there's always a degree of naturalism or realism or whatever you want to call it, often with intense color and sometimes with almost a palpable, I think, sense of light. I would complete the whole paintings on site, constantly referencing the actual place that I was looking at. I did work in series though, which I'm still doing. And in the new work, in this work, I didn't know in advance where I was going for the first time. When you're sitting out there on the landscape, you have an idea of what you're looking at and what you want to get out of it and how you want to represent it. But in these, I had milkweed, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it. The new ideas kept emerging from the materials themselves, just having them around the studio. It wasn't a world that I found, it was a world that I made. It was very different. I mean, all art is an invention of some sort, but this kind of invention was very new to me. Before, I painted things that existed in the real world, but these exist only on paper. I think I had in the earlier work a kind of energy and exuberance at times and immediacy, and sometimes there were elements of metaphor. I'll talk about that briefly later on. But there wasn't much mystery to what I was doing, and I think in some of these there is for the first time. So I wanted to show you examples of that, of former work, if I can remember how we do this. Yes, okay. Not too complicated. This is dated in 1984 when I was living in New York City. I was a young artist then. I worked during the day and painted out on the streets at night and did a whole series of paintings at the streets at night. I can't be distracted with little stories, but I just have to tell you this one. I was painting in a bus stop in the rain one night, and the 104 bus, the Broadway bus came down, and the guy came out of the bus and he comes to me and he said, I've been on this route now for twice. It was like 2 a.m. He said, I've seen you out here. And he said, it's like that movie about Van Gogh. He just had to do it, right? And then one night I was painting in the same spot in front of a bar, and the bartender brought me a drink. And one last story. This drank on too long, but I was painting at another site, and this guy, this gigantic man, in a motorcycle with all kinds of stuff there on his nose and his ears and coming out and things like that. I thought, it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm all by myself on the street and up in Broadway, and I thought, oh God, this is it. It's over. And he comes over and he goes, hey. I said, yes. He said, can you paint my bike? And I was so touched. I said, I wish I could, but I'm not very good with machinery. All right. It's a different kind of work. So anyway, this is just one. This is up on Broadway, looking north, towards Columbia. This is 107th Street. I also did a series of prints. When I learned how to make etchings, and I did some prints. Had a press at home. I did some prints. This was an offset monotype that I made years later from a painting that I had done on the streets in New York. And this, I had my brother, who is somewhere there. My brother is a classical trumpet player and introduced me to the conductor of the orchestra of the Paul Taylor Dance Company, who this was in the winter and it was too cold to go outside and paint. And he let me come and sit in the pit and draw during rehearsals and during the performances. I'm sorry to have to tell these kind of stories. I was sitting in the string section, and they asked me to move because they said the scratching, and they listened so intently while they're working. They said the scratching of my charcoal on the page was very distracting. So I moved over next to the timpani. He didn't notice. But so I did lots of drawings, and then I did a bunch of paintings from the drawings, and some of the musicians, one trombone player, was kind enough to come to my studio, and I just couldn't get it right, you know, how to get his arms and legs to look like they were doing the right thing, and I did a whole series of that. And I've still been painting at night, so when I moved up here to take the job at Dartmouth, I thought, I'll just keep on painting at night. And I went outside, it was totally dark. I couldn't see a thing. Even downtown Hanover, 10 o'clock, all was dark. So I couldn't continue what I was doing. So but I did find these pulp and paper mills that operated all night long. And so one summer, that's what I did. I traveled up to them, and I would paint all night. And this is the James River Mill in Groveton, New Hampshire. And they were very dramatic and beautiful and strange. And the guys were at first surprised and suspicious of me standing there, but then they got to be very friendly. And it was, there are too many stories, I can't go on, but it was a great experience. I did a series of that, these during the summer. And then when my daughter, Katie, was growing up, I got interested in her toys. Now this is the only one I'm going to show, but these series really were full of metaphor, and I was conscious of it at the time. I was thinking about how, in this case, how young women find their identities and how fractured they are through the different exposures that they get, and how you piece together who you are from what you see and what you do, and lots of other things. So the whole series was about that, and it was kind of my reflections on aspects of childhood that I got to see while she was playing with her toys. And then I started noticing in the daytime the landscape around here, which isn't too shabby. It's quite beautiful, and I found sites close to where I was living, particularly in these stream beds, that really interested me. And I would set up in the stream bed. This is on Upper Turnpike Road in Norwich. It was one of the first ones. This is on New Boston Road, just above the dump in Norwich. It's just the road curves around up there. And I found a lovely site, and I painted in there on all. I would set up. This is a fairly large painting. I set it up in there and work on it for many weeks. And I did seasonal paintings in there, as long as this was an autumn one. This was the sort of midsummer one. These are pretty large paintings. This is now, I think, in the collection of my dear friend Don Metz. And I also got interested in a very strange thing. I bought some of this orange fencing from a highway supply company, and I set it up in the landscape because I was interested in the artificiality of this geometric grid placed in nature, and how the two things would work together. Have it in green and blue and orange, and set it up in streams and in the hillsides, and painted the two things together for a couple summers, which was an interesting project. I was lucky enough to teach and paint in Italy, in Umbria, one summer and the following fall. When the weather was still good, I could do landscapes like this. Umbria is not unlike this area, except every inch of it is cultivated. You know, every inch is accounted for. There isn't like vast tracts of forests that nobody's ever been in. You feel like everybody's been on every inch of the land there. But it was very beautiful, and it was a wonderful experience. And then in the fall in Umbria, I had no idea this would happen, but the fog rolls in and it completely covers some of the towns. You walk through the town. I thought Perugia was on fire. I didn't understand that it was I thought it was smoke, but it's fog that completely, it just rolls in and covers the towns. So it was a great opportunity to paint that. And I think in some ways the limited palette of this, and I'm sure I'm going to show you a few more that have a limited color, maybe helped me be ready to do something that had no color at all. Because the more limited the color, the more delicate the relationships are between colors. And I had no idea I was heading this way, but this was an interesting experience for me to paint like this. When I got back, this is in Vermont, I found, I somehow never noticed before that in the fall, that happens here too. You never notice it. The fog rolls in and it kind of collects in between the hills and changes the whole nature of the landscape as you look at it. I don't want to dwell too long on this. My studio at the time was here in Lebanon, in the Whitman building, and I was on the third floor with a window looking directly down on a section of the Mascoma River. And so I painted that in every season of the year. And look, that one little section looked very different every season of the year. This obviously was the winter, but it's interesting to me, and I didn't think of this until I put these slides together, that this too has a limited palette. and working in, I hadn't realized before how much I had gone from the wildly, it's kind of exuberant color to these more limited colors, and ended up here with no color at all. This is the same place, the exact same place as this. You can see that branch, that tree trunk across there. I guess you can't see, it's washed away here. But in this one, you can see the little trees growing in the front. And there are the little trees. This is what happens in the spring in the Mascoma River. It washes down and it completely covers everything. And it's a very exciting thing to look at. I also was painting, I love this misty stuff, and I was very early one morning, I was on my way to paint something else, but I passed my Long Wind farm where they grow tomatoes, and I really loved how it looked. This too is in the collection of my dear friend Don Metzi. This was on Route 5 going north. I got interested in that question, which resonates with this work too, of presence and absence, and what makes something appear to have substance, even if you can't identify the substance, you don't know exactly what it is, but what gives you the sense of substance or presence, and how delicate can it be, and how much do you have to describe? This is another one I did of the Line Bridge, the one that we can no longer use. But again, as with the fencing, the orange fencing, I really love this combination of geometry and landscape, the steel structure in the middle of nature, tempered by this mist, and tempered and softened by this mist everywhere, really transformed the landscape. But during that time, I just got really hungry for color. So, all that restraint. So Dan Abyss was selling these wonderful greens that had been beautifully packaged by the grower, and I bought several of them, and I started with little studies, and I made several large paintings. This is 4 feet by 4 feet, and I put color underneath them. I really just was hungry for color, so I went back to using color in these larger paintings. And I had also been enchanted by a basket of garlic scapes, which is when you grow garlic, the tops come out of the ground and they curl around. And so I bought a lot of them and set them up in my studio and did a lot of work from them, which I'm going to show you different examples of. This is a print. It's a combination of a laser etching, stencil, and monotype painting for those printmakers who are here. I know there's at least one. It's about this big. And this is also a laser etching on plexiglass. 2 plates, the darker one printed on, the first one printed with the light green and the darker one printed on top of it. And this is a drawing from I call this one Baroque Bouquet. It's a drawing that I did from the garlic scapes. Okay, now, how do I get it black?
Oh, the next one. That's the one after the monkey.
Oh, okay. Oh, no. All right, it's one after. Thank you. Okay. The last one I'll show you of this earlier work is the first one I did of the Milkweed, which I'll get to in a minute. So, in 2021, my husband, the poet and writing professor, Gary Lenhart, died from complications of brain tumor. I was so deeply changed by this loss that I felt like a stranger in my own studio. The world didn't beckon as it had before. I wasn't engaged by its sights. I didn't have the same curiosity or even the same ambition. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know how to be an artist. Life went flavorless, at first in an emotional sense, but then, due to COVID, I believe, in a very literal sense, I lost my sense of taste and smell. By slow degrees, I did come back to a productive life, but I owe my renewed vitality entirely to my daughter, Katie Lenhart, who she had never known me to be without purpose. and fortunately for me, was very lovingly concerned about my well-being. She was working at Cedar Circle Farm that summer, and she'd bring me home these, because I had been drawing the garlic scapes and the other plants, she would bring me home these plants that were lovely, flowers and things that they had grown, thinking that I would be interested in them, but nothing really moved me at all. But she was persistent, and one time she brought home, it turned out to be life-changing actually, she brought home this bucket of milkweed and left it in my studio overnight, and in the morning I came down, and the pods had kind of opened, and these little parachutes were flying around, wafting around in the air. And I've said this to other people, and I know it sounds corny, but it really felt like Gary's spirit was floating around in the air. And it was just, I don't know, it sounds so corny, but it's really what happened. And it just felt like he was keeping me company. They're both very ephemeral. They weigh nothing. And I brought some for everybody to look at and touch if they want. And very tenacious, like he was actually. They're very sticky. They don't decompose. They don't rot. They just stay forever. they're amazing. It's an amazing substance. It's like there's nothing there, but it's like the sturdiest thing that could ever exist. It was really true. So anyway, they seem to exist in this world, but also in another one, a weightless one, a one without gravity or substance. So in their company, the company of this milkweed, I gradually sort of regained my curiosity and began a domestic adventure exploring the new subject. I wonder now if my emotional rootlessness helped me step away from the familiar, from what I'd done before, and into a new territory. It was very tentative in the beginning. I didn't know what to do with it. So I said, well, I'll just start with drawing, the most basic thing there is. This was the first drawing I did, not a great drawing. It was just a little drawing, actually, but it was something. And drawing it got me interested and kept me going. The others then followed, and you'll see they're all numbered. They're in succession as they happened in the studio. While I was exploring this new subject, my poet friend Cleopatra Mathis sent me a prose piece by Barbara Hurd entitled "Milkweed Pod: A Still Life," which came eerily close in moments to my own experience. Hurd explained later, this is our quote, "I wrote Milkweed some months after my husband died. In the ensuing silence, maybe exploring the plant's discarded pod was one way I've been trying to keep my attention fastened to this world." And here are a couple short paragraphs from her piece. Quote, "In October, the milkweed pod, both nest and next, begins its first and final letting go. Temperatures drop, the pod dries up, the seam on its outer side begins to split. Exposed to air and rain, the silky filaments unfasten themselves. The seeds are lifted and strewn by any bit of breeze. And now in November, after the bustle of dispersion, here is the splayed open milkweed pod, a broken, ghostly container which has just been emptied. Autumn is a season of wreckage, slit pods, split husks, the spent cones of cucumber trees, white residue of the milkweed tassels, also known as coma. Something about the debris after liftoff/drop-off quickens my spirits, the sudden coalescing around what has just disappeared, the hard luminosity of last moments before the final fling into the ongoing, ceaseless flow of the world as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Milkweeds are best known as the plant that the caterpillar of the monarch butterfly must feed on. Say milkweed, and most people picture the monarchs in mass migrations to Mexico, the orangey banner-like swaths that flutter overhead and remind us of the miracle of their flight. Not me, or at least not now. I'm more interested in what remains once the monarchs are gone. Whether the plant itself will die or reseed or push another shoot from its rhizomic tangle beneath the ground. This, my love, is how grief happens. The milkweed pod unfolds its emptiness, an image which contradicts itself, subverts its own claim, which is how I'm learning to live without you. End quote. Sorry. I was interested also in a very different kind of response to these images from my friend Greg Masters, who's a New York City poet. And he remarked that the show seemed to him like chamber music. If my previous work was usually full orchestra, I guess comparisons can be made. For one thing, a chamber is with a much more intimate space. Reduced orchestration can also be more intimate, but also at the same time complex, and still contain a range of moods and musical voices. The effect can be enveloping of a chamber music, but maybe not as overpowering as a full orchestra. He went on to write, subtle at first glance, but oh my, the pods release their delicate fertile wisps to renew and replenish and revive our focus, end quote. Also at this time, my brother Jay sent me the new biography of Pissarro. He's often called the father of Impressionism. The author mentions Pissarro's ability to, quote, reconcile objectivity with subjectivity. And this is Pissarro's conviction, and these are Pissarro's words. Work is a marvelous regulator of moral and physical health. All the sadness, all the grief, I forget these in the joy of working. So much for my literary companions during this time. I'd like to speak now about the actual work of making these drawings. This is what my studio looks like, part of it, while I was making them. And you can see it's full of milkweed. That container is right over there. I brought a lot of it in to show you. Over on the table here, when we're done, there's the stalks, and then there's some pods, and then there's a box of fluff. And there's also some drawing material, some paper, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and I hope everybody will give it a shot and see how. You don't have to draw milkweed, you can draw anything you want. I'd like to speak now about the actual work of making these drawings. As I said before, I was no longer finding the site and recreating it. When forms are taken out of context, they seem so different. They have a different character. And you can create a new context with them. And the mood is very different from my earlier work, more strange, more wistful, more unfamiliar, I think. And for me, the strength was not so much in recognition of something, but in like redefining or redefinition of something. I stayed with the most basic art materials, which were charcoal, paper, and erasers. That was it. I pared it down as far as I could go. I guess I could not have erasers, but that was an indulgence. Charcoal is probably the oldest. I think it goes back like 30,000 years, as far as we know, maybe more. In this case, it's the simplest of all. The charcoal I used was the simplest kind of charcoal. They're either grapevines or willow vines that have been picked and heated in ovens until they actually become carbonized sticks. And I have a bunch of them in that box there, which I hope you will try. Just make marks with them and see what it feels like. Unlike compressed charcoal, vine charcoal doesn't have wax or any gum or binding material to make it thick and heavy and sticky. So it's almost powdery, actually. It's in a stick, but almost powdery. And because of that quality, you can put lots of layers in. If you have a good sturdy paper, which this is all Reeves BFK, good high quality rag paper, you can erase and add and erase and add and erase and add as long as your paper holds up to it. and because the charcoal is so malleable, and it can appear and disappear very easily, and it's a wonderful material to use. The process grew both as an invention and as a metaphor. It always seemed to me to be metaphorically and realistic and really about presence and absence. I began by covering the page with charcoal, and this was an example. I covered the whole thing with charcoal, and then with my fingers, usually, or sometimes with a rag, rub it down till I get a kind of a tonal background that I want. It doesn't stay that way, but it gives, without the tonal background, because it's just working on white, the whites wouldn't be significant. So you have to have some tone to get the whites work against. And as I worked on these, some have a darker and some have everything changes, the relationships of the values. Values is the art word for lights and darks. Unfortunately, it's not the word for money, that kind of value. Sorry. So I would erase out elements of the form, and in this one I had set up a still life and was starting to do it. But then at night, the whole thing collapsed. In the middle of the night, I came in the back in the morning and it was all on the floor. And I knew I couldn't finish the drawing, so I thought, well, I'll just bring it in and show an example of how I actually start. and I started by erasing them. I started with the most prominent element. And I have little marks here kind of indicating where the other things, this was going to be a bouquet, kind of indicating where the other things were going to be, but very loosely. Because when I work like this, I never do outlines first and then fill them in, because it doesn't allow enough change of the relationship between the parts. There has to be more flexibility between the parts to make a whole that feels like a living thing to me instead of just something that's pasted on. So it makes it much more complicated, but I think in the end you get a more resonant result if you're always shifting and moving things back and forth. So it starts out very tentatively with something that kind of anchors the whole thing. In this case it was at the top, it isn't always, sometimes it's in the middle. And then the rest would have grown around it after weeks and weeks of drawing. It takes a long time. The bouquet that's out there took many weeks. It just resisted me for so long, but it came out okay. So by erasing a form into being, you're creating a presence out of absence. You can pull light out of dark. And I think in a metaphorical sense, I learned that loss could in some way be gain. The lack of color allows more attention to be paid to value, to lights and darks, and to the surface, which can be airy or dense, shallow or deep, active or quiet, and the mark itself, which can be crisp or soft, energetic or calm, forceful or delicate, opaque or transparent. So there are all these variables to work in with no color at all, just values of gray and darks, black and white. The plant itself has so many different qualities, and I hope you'll get a chance when you look at these to see the different qualities of the plant, which for when you're driving by on the side of the road, you don't really notice. It's got these fluffy little parachutes and a very hard shell. Then it's got straight stems plus little curvy, very lovely little curvy stems in there. The dense dark seeds, which act as both a steer and an anchor. It kind of steers the parachute along. The sensual slit in the pods and the caressable silks of the parachutes. It all seems at once both permanent and fragile, made to last and contain, but also to open and disperse. All these contradictions opened up for me an unusual abstraction of form. As I said before, I consider myself a realist, but in many ways, these were more abstract than anything I'd ever done. I started each one directly from observation. I'm going to point out, this one here started out as horizontal, but I didn't like what was happening to it horizontally, and I turned it vertically, and I liked it much better as an event. I can't describe what the event is, but it worked so much better for me. So, I mean, that was a kind of freedom. You can't do that when you're doing a landscape and get away with it in the same kind of way. And 21, the one over there in the back, the long horizontal one, I had made that one vertical originally, and Sam was kind enough to take a little photo of it vertically and put it next to it so you could see what it looked like when I actually started it. But Dick the framer liked it horizontally, so I said, okay, that's good. And he framed it so it could be held either way, horizontal or vertical. And in, let's see, which one? That one there behind. Yeah, that began when I thought I brought it, maybe I forgot. I have a black, yeah, I guess I forgot to bring it. A black cutting mat, I think I left it in my car actually. It's just a black cutting mat and it has a gray grid on it. And the milkweed just happened to be on it. And all of a sudden I noticed that there was this plant material was on a grid, and I thought, that's a really interesting combination of this natural thing with this sort of implacable grid shape. And it gave me ideas about a background that I'm still working on. So I did that one, and then, let me just move this slightly. This was the next one I did, that same subject, where I removed all the seeds and really focused on getting what they call the negative space, which is a word I hate, but the negative shapes in there between the thing. So it became much more abstract and interesting. And I have other ideas. The one in the back there is also on the grid. That one, I think I can say this without weeping. That one seemed to be about Gary's spirit lifting off and the rest of us down below. Anyway, so most of them were set up some way in my studio. They weren't natural, but I took the stuff and I set them up. But the only one that wasn't was that middle one over there, the large one. It never actually existed in that physical conglomeration. All the elements were observed from reality, observed, but I put them together willfully. They never existed together. So I invented the composition, which was a whole new process for me. And really exciting. I mean, I know people have been working that way for years, but I haven't. And it was really, really nice. So I brought things here. I brought papers and charcoal. And what I would recommend is, if you want to just take a piece of paper and make some marks. I brought a whole tray full of erasers, all different. I use lots of different kinds of erasers. The Mars plastic erasers are particularly nice. And if you want to really get jazzy, you could try my electric erasers. They are really nice. You can draw with white in a way and a lot of these really brilliant whites come from having an electric eraser. I couldn't do them without that. So I have 3 or 4 of them, which I recommend that you try and get a sense of it. I'm not quite done with this process yet. I don't know where it's going to go yet. I have some kind of inklings about color, but it's just they're very just inklings. They're nothing clear yet, so I'm not sure if that will happen. But the twists and turns have been very engaging for me at a difficult time, and made them feel like something full of potential instead of something full of loss. I have some stories in my head about different ones of these, but I love to hear what comes to mind for others. My brother, for example, I saw this as a performer on a stage with an audience, and my brother saw it as a sailboat and with a big wave coming up behind it. If you're so inclined, I'd love to hear what you see. And thank you very much for being here.
The constellations.
Yes.
24. Okay. And it's often used, the expression is often used to describe the forms it uses as hemi, demi, semi-quavers. So there's a musical quality to basically the abstraction of.
Yeah, that's nice.
So my question has to do with what I see is a calligraphy in your work, At the same time, I also see the work as the writing of light, so I see it as photographic in some ways. Not the process, which is completely different,
Right,
but the
right.
result that one looks at.
Yeah.
So do you see, I mean, you're using forms over and over again. That one looks like, the self-portrait, Miro's self-portrait of his head
Oh, yeah,
with
yeah.
all the stars.
Yeah.
Okay, so
That's
there's-
great, I love that, I never thought of that.
Well, there's a lot of calligraphy in this.
Yeah.
A lot of, and that calligraphy is not symbolic in the sense that it has
Right.
no meaning. How do you feel about that?
It's interesting you should say that, because that one that I was talking about before that I made up, I really, for the first time, I actually thought of calligraphy. I thought about those lines as calligraphic lines in this nest of softness and things like that, and how they made shapes and created movement across the piece, instead of relying on perspective or spatial illusions like that. It was the calligraphy of the mark making. So you're right on. You're right on about that. And I think the materials, as you look at them, they really lend themselves to that, because the lovely twists and turns of the stalks and the delicacy of the the curves of the seeds and the delicacy of the silks. Everything about the physical presence of them is almost calligraphic. So they weren't so much about space or the illusion of space as my previous work had been, more about surface, I guess, in some ways, so that's a very interesting point. Yeah. Anybody else have any questions? I know this, it's hard to come up with questions, and I don't mind if you don't have any questions. But, yeah.
With divine charcoal, it's such a difficult, it erases so fast. So how did you work with that? It's not like regular charcoal where...
Yeah, carefully.
Yeah, but it seems like you could just brush it and be gone.
You could.
Right?
You could. And that's, by the way, you see, these are drawings that are covered with paper so that I wouldn't brush it and have it disappear. I was standing here doing this one, but these two were done, and I covered them up with glassine, so I wouldn't do that. And yeah, it's a concern. But then you get to, like with many dangers, it becomes something that you relish and get excited by, and you use to your best advantage, because it's so flexible. You can get rid of something, put something down and get rid of it immediately by wiping it away, and then that gives you great flexibility instead of having to work your way around it in some way.
Right. And so then how did you fix it?
I sprayed, I took it outdoors and sprayed it with fixative, special French fixative for charcoal, and did it back and forth. Did it 3 times in different directions, letting it sit in between, so it's got 3 layers of fixative.
And does that really fix it?
Pretty much. Yeah. If you really went in there with a metric eraser, you go right to the fixative. But no, yeah, it kept it. But I didn't do that until the very end, until I was sure that I didn't want to work on it anymore. Yeah.
And what was your process? How long did this, say one of them take, or this series, how long did
The series went on, it's been going on for 2.5 years now. And each one took a long time. Just because you're putting all these parts together, and there's so many little parts, and how they work together is so complicated. And when I didn't know what I was doing, which I didn't until I was kind of doing it, I didn't know where I was going, so I couldn't head directly in that way. I had to kind of go this way and that way and try to find where I was going, circuitously. So they took many weeks, some of them months, to do. Yes, Cheryl?
So it sounds to me like in some respects you were working intuitively, which wasn't what you were doing necessarily when you were doing the more figurative things.
Yeah.
And, but correct me if I'm wrong, but also, were you working on more than one piece simultaneously?
No. I would work on one until I finished it. I think, yeah. I had ideas, and I had a little notebook down here where I would write down ideas that I got while I was working on one piece. But no, I could never do that. Maybe that's part of my temperament. I can't do a bunch of different things all at once. I have to kind of focus because, I feel like I get in it, and it's in that world, and I don't want to step out and have to readjust to another one. But that's a good question, and I never really thought about that before, but no, I don't. In paintings, I do. I would have a car with different paintings in the back depending, so I was ready for any weather condition. But not on these, I guess because the conditions were controlled and I could pretty much say, yeah.
Will you be continuing with drawing, or do you think of trying to take this into painting?
I don't know. I wish I could say, but in some ways I'm glad I can't say, because maybe the adventure will continue better if I don't know where I'm going and just follow whatever impulses there are. And you know, I'm very lucky to be retired from work and to have the studio and be able to do this for the first time in my life. So I mean, there's been a terrible loss and change of life, but there's also been nice things that happen too. So I don't know. I would like to get some color. I'm starting to think it'd be nice to get some color, but I don't know how yet. Have you seen the stamps, by the way? They have these stamps called from tulips. I got some from the post office, and they're beautiful. They look like little milkweed parachutes, and they're beautiful color. I was inspired by the stamps. I don't know what happens. I'll let you know. Yeah.
Is there yes. Do you discern a difference in your approach or in your result between the beginning work that you did and the later work in this series? Was there a progression in some way?
No, there was no actual progression. They got bigger. I mean, they did grow in size, and maybe that's part of growing in ambition. But I can't say, it's interesting, I can't say that they changed in terms of realism particularly. They just seemed to move from one thing to another. But it wasn't frightening because there were so many things that were the same. You know, I wasn't knocked off balance by how different they were. It was kind of intriguing how different they were. And it kept me interested, because it could have gotten pretty boring doing pretty much the same thing with a slight variation from one to another. But doing what seemed like very different things from one to another kept it adventurous. That's an interesting idea.
Did you try different different papers? Because I know Reeves is so soft.
Yeah. No, I've worked with Reeves for a long time in printmaking and in drawing, and one side is slightly softer than the other of it, but I just felt so comfortable with it that that's something that I could try, but I haven't felt impelled to do it. And it's funny how I just keep the parameters narrow so that the invention can be greater.
That makes sense.
It's never made sense before, but it seems to right now. So, yeah.
So a lot of it is subtractive, you're taking charcoal off. Did you find that you were going both directions, like you going back in and putting in the
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and that was great, and that's another benefit of this fine charcoal, because with compressed charcoal, you put it there and it's held, you have to scrape it off, you can't get rid of it. But the vine charcoal, it can go away, you can leave bits of it, it can be a ghost of itself, and you can create layers and layers, and that was really, with a sturdy enough paper, that was a great gift. Yeah, really, really nice. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the Pizarro quote that you kind of opened up with, and you wrapped it up in this sort of story of going through grief and understanding yourself and rediscovering your ambition and yourself as an artist in the world, which I found really wrapped everything together. I was wondering, and you pointed out a few pieces, and I was wondering if there were any single piece that sort of was this like aha moment that this is you kind of returning to a part of yourself or transforming that.
Many of them were. That one that I mentioned before, where I actually started inventing and using calligraphy that wasn't, putting things together, that was kind of an aha moment for me, because I had always worked directly from something that I saw. And even though those are observed portions, the elements are observed, the composition was made up. And that was an aha moment for me. I don't know if I'll do it all the time from now on, but it was an exciting moment for me. And there were exciting moments as I was working. How to how to make something that feels fluffy. I mean, it sounds trivial when I say it like that, but to put marks down to make it have a sense of density, but transparency at the same time, was when I got that. Those are aha moments. And then, when little discoveries that happened in each one. There were plenty of little aha moments, which is what made what seems like a very kind of limited experience very exciting to me. I hope that answers your question enough. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yes?
Hi, Louise.
Hi.
I may have missed this, but did the various renditions of the compositions that you made, were the ideas sparked from the elements of the silkweed, the seeds, and the
Yeah.
like?
I probably didn't talk about that enough. I mean, I had these things in my studio, and I would look at them and say, well, what if I put this next to this? And then I put another one next to that, and they look like a row standing up, and ended up being like that one over there. They look like performers on the stage.
Oh, yeah.
So it was fooling around with the materials, getting them all together and just looking at them and observing things about them and saying, well, what if I do this? And this box, you can see, is full of milkweed, which is a substance that I had never really experienced before. And I urge you all to come do this and get familiar with this stuff. You can take a little bit home. I noticed that there's this in the parking lot. You may not be able to prevent yourself from doing something else. So having it around allowed me just to play with it, and I got ideas from doing that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Just one other observation, that you're drawing with the grid background. That reminds me of the orange grid stuff that you're working with, the plastic.
Oh, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
How stupid of me. Yeah. I never thought of that. No. It's great. I applied for a grant, which I didn't get recently. Which was I was nominated to apply for a Prix de Rome, and I had to come up with what I would do if I got it. And I was involved in this work, and I thought it would be really interesting to have local plants in Rome and in different areas of Italy growing over some of the sculptural reliefs and things in the Parthenon and other. That's not it. That's growing over some of the backgrounds there, and that could be the way these milkweeds are over the grid could have more historical significance, and I kind of wrote it up, but nobody bought it, so I didn't get the grant. But I have been thinking about that too, of how the subject matter can change depending on how, putting the grid behind it was one thing. Well, what if I put something else behind it? And what will happen? And that, oh my God, I could work on this for the rest of my life. Yeah. I'm 74 years old, so that's not that much longer. It could last though, yeah.
Speaking of backgrounds, I was just kind of curious if there was a story about the monkey, popping out of the box.
Well, that's exactly what happened. I was going to get some milkweed to look at it, and I opened the box, and it popped out. And I thought, that's interesting. And that's how subject matter appeared. And I thought, I'm going to try to do this, but I purposely said, I drew it, little sketches, and I was trying to figure out how to compose it. And I said, I don't want it to be like a box surrounded by, on a table surrounded by air. So I want the rectangles of the lids to go off in different angles, so that those rectangles became more abstract, as abstract shapes. But still, I want to get a sense of the box. So I actually cut it down because the rectangles just got too weird and didn't look like a box anymore until I shaved it down a little bit, and then it started to look like a box. And then I also had too much of the stuff coming out, and it didn't look like it was popping. It looked like it was just fluffing or something. So I had to erase a lot of them, or rub a lot of them out and put it down to what I've got. But that's exactly what happened. I just opened the box and I came up. There you go.
I really like the different shades of the background, so you get a different sense of the weight or I don't know, it's just.
There's on both the upper left and upper right, there are those lighter shapes. And I was trying to think about the box lid shapes and those shapes as abstract geometric shapes that would sometimes read flat as geometry and sometimes read as a volume in space. So playing with that is really fun. That's great that you observed that. What a great audience. Can I take him home?
I have one more question.
Sure.
To what extent were you involved in still life going to the original, the material object that's on in front of you, and then leaving it and playing and working on the forms on paper, going back and forth? In that respect, it is like your landscape painting.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true, because I did set up these still lifes. So I was tied to, but I created them. And then the difference was when I drew them successfully, they didn't look like a still life drawing, they looked like a world that I'd made. So that's slightly different than going out into the world and trying to bring that world onto the canvas or a piece of paper. But setting them up, I welcomed the artificiality of that, and then I wanted it to be convincing in a different way when it was actually drawn as a world. So it was a very different experience. It was really interesting. Yes, Nancy.
When you created these worlds, how did it affect you emotionally?
Well, it would depend. It would depend on whether they were successful or not. That one down there, I was so angry at it for being so difficult, like a difficult child. But when I got it, it was wonderful, because it was something I'd never seen before, and I felt like I was creative in a way that I'd never been before, because I made something that I had never imagined, and so it was wonderful, and
You learned something about yourself.
I did, yeah, and I also learned that you can have a full life, even if it's tinged with loneliness or other things. And you can still be strong and acknowledge your loss, but rejoice in your gain. So that's how it was.
Amen.
Amen. I think that's it.